You ain't mad, are you?
Just when you thought you'd seen it all.
You want to see something really scary? Yeah.
Were they both naked? How were they killed?
Horn, I'll do anything for you.
His knife has got to be his penis.
Betty's dead. What happened? What?
Oh, there was this guy who she didn't go to bed with, but who called up all the time. He was Mexican or something. Every once in a while, he'd say something in Spanish.
You speak Spanish, huh? A little.
You never made it with a girl because girls won't have anything to do with you, but you get back at them, don't you?
Quiero mamarte la panocha.
What does that mean?
Means I want to eat your pussy.
You ever seen one of these before? What's it used for? It's for jacking off, isn't it?
Maybe we should check your prostate.
Kiss my ass, cunt. Your father's a pig, your mother's a whore.
Who told you that's supposed to be a secret?
Now, will you please answer the question, why was she afraid of him?
He was always talking about people who put him down and how he was going to get even with them.
I got the biggest one you ever seen.
The facts are we got no evidence and we can't hold this kid. He's got an ironclad alibi.
Is that true, Lieutenant? You planted the evidence?
Yes.
Oh, my God. Don't open that door!
I am sick. I am sick. You can't punish me. I'm sick. You can't punish me for being sick.
This is Don Franks from My Bloody Valentine, and you're listening to The Hysteria Continues.
And indeed you are. Welcome back to The Hysteria Continues. This is episode 230. And this time we're edging ever closer to midnight in the Charles Bronson, J. Lee Thompson meeting of minds, as it were, if that's the right way of saying it. I'm not sure it is, but 10 to Midnight, the kind of slasher cop procedural vigilante mashup that came out from Cannon Films in 1983. So, yes, it's one we've been looking forward to covering for a while, although let's see, we'll reserve judgment to see if it's actually a film we like. But we two bits of news from the off is one that unfortunately Nathan can't join us today, so hopefully he'll either drop his thoughts in later or next time when we record. But we're joined very happily by one of our favourite people, Amanda Reyes, film historian and all-round wonderful person, is here now. Amanda, how are you doing?
I'm really good. How are you?
Not bad. I'm kind of pretty good, really. I think I only had a couple of beers last night, so my head is quite clear, which I think is always good news.
Thing to celebrate. You should celebrate with the drink.
Well, I've done enough of these things with a hangover over the years. Not so many recently, but it's always nice when I have a nice clear head.
Okay, I can take that so many different ways. Don't do this to me so early in the morning.
Okay, well, how's your head, Erik, this morning?
Mine is fine. I mean, I'm on medication at the moment, so I can't drink any alcohol, sadly. So, yes, I'm bright and bushy.
Well, that's good to hear it. So, and Joseph, how are you doing this fine morning?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Very good. So, yes, well, the gang's all here, apart from Nathan, who will be missed, but will be back. So, just like the killer in the old Federal Massacre, he will return. So, 10 to Midnight's coming up a little bit later. Let's have a quick chat about what we've been watching recently, if you've had a chance to watch anything. As always, very special guest, Amanda. Is there anything you've seen recently you want to tell us about?
Yeah, I've been watching a lot of things because I picked up a lot of work this year, which I'm really excited about, but it means I've been watching all kinds of different movies. And I also watched a TV show yesterday, which I think is relevant to our topic tonight. So I'll just briefly go over what I saw. So I saw for the very, very first time a couple weeks ago a movie called The Pajama Girl Case, which I'm guessing, Justin, you're semi-familiar with because it's a giallo from the late 70s. And it's a really weird movie. It's based on a true story, and it's not a weird movie. It's a very good movie. But what I mean, it's a weird movie because it's like an Italian director that went to Australia to shoot a movie with like German actors. And it's like the most international film I've ever seen, but it's loosely based on a true story about a woman named Linda Agostino who was murdered. And I think one of the things that attracted whoever wrote the screenplay was that when they found her body and they didn't know who had murdered her, they actually put it on display in a case, like somewhere in Australia where people could come. I think they couldn't identify who she was originally or something like that. And so that's incorporated into the film. But the movie itself is a really interesting, I don't know enough about the background of it to really speak about the inspiration, but it's a really interesting movie about people who are kind of living in poverty and how we treat the bodies of the dead and also the people who've committed the crimes when they come from a poorer section of the world. And it was really interesting because the movie's about immigrants coming to Australia and then this thing happening and how they're kind of treated in the process of it. And so it was this really interesting movie and I loved it. And then I also saw a movie called Blood Bride, it's either from 1980 or 1982. I've read different production dates, which I'm not sure is a horror movie, but it's been marketed as such. If anybody here remembers the VHS cover, I think it's like a bride holding a knife or something like that. And it starred a woman named Ellen Barber and a man named Philip English, who that same year would make a TV movie called Born Beautiful together. But it's about this woman who's like this very religious, kind of virginal 20-something-year-old who meets this guy and falls in love with him and marries him. But right off the bat, he's like insane and he's got this like kind of fetish for like nuns and sex. And it's a really weird movie. It's very slow. There's not a lot of violence in it. When the violence that is in it is kind of distasteful because it's in that it's about an abused housewife. But it's a really interesting movie. I kind of couldn't stop thinking about it after I saw it. So I thought I'd mention it here because it was marketed as a horror movie. It's more of a thriller. The guy who wrote it, Richard J. Averick, would go on to write Body Double. So I thought it was kind of interest to people. And then I saw The Uninvited, which is that infamous cat inside a cat horror film. I just watched that last week with some friends of mine online. And we had a blast. I never get tired of watching that movie. It's so crisp and fun and bright and ridiculous. And it's everything you want. And one of the things I love about it is that the actors are so committed to their performances. We were talking about this, that I don't know how well you guys remember the movie, but the girl who's on the ship, the really beautiful blonde who looks like Sharon Stone, her name's Sherry Shattuck. And she's going crazy as like the cat keeps killing more and more of them. And she's like in her own movie. It's like she's in like a Midnight Lace film, like, you know what I mean? And it's on the opposite side of the boat. And then everybody else is doing something else on the other side. But the acting is really good. It's a lot of fun. But the thing
what I love about her character, sorry to interrupt you, Amanda, is what always strikes me is that maybe the passage of time isn't possibly explained in the properly explained in the film, but it seems that they turn to starvation and desperation for food within a few hours of being on the boat, which would be normal for me, but for the average person, I think they like she's sort of desperate for food, and yet she's only like not eaten for maybe 2 hours.
Yeah, I know. There's actually a movie that reminds me of, but I don't want to spoil it, so I may send you a little message later about a movie that does that. That's hilarious. But yeah, it's like she just goes crazy really quick, but she's so good in the part that like it's almost like the cat came in later, like they were going to make a drama about people being stuck on a boat together. And then they made the movie and they're like, it's not really working. We should have a mutant cat living inside a regular cat. Okay, let's do that. And then they incorporated the cat into the film. I mean, that's kind of what it feels like when you're watching it. And the three main actors, the really famous ones, Clu Gulager, Alex Cord, and George Kennedy, are great in it. Especially Alex Cord, who I think sometimes isn't always the best actor in a film. But like, I can't believe how good the cast is. And I'm guessing it was meant to be a comedy. And they just played it really straight to bring out the comedy elements. I can't really tell, and that's what makes the movie so much fun for me. But she's my favorite element of it. And I really love the fashion-forward, like, ripped T-shirt bikini wear that they put on throughout the film. It's pretty fabulous. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but they look great in it. So I'm not going to question it. But the last thing I watched, so last night I watched the pilot to The Equalizer with Queen Latifah. And it struck me as something I would want to bring up here because we're going to be talking about 10 to Midnight and vigilante movies. And if I can remember at the end of me talking a little bit about the history of vigilante movies, we may want to talk about where The Equalizer sits with films like 10 to Midnight and Death Wish in particular, because I think it's actually bringing on a new dimension to the the vigilante film, and it was fascinating. Also, I thought it was a really good pilot. I don't watch a lot of new TV. This is very much comfort viewing. If you like shows like Hawaii Five-0 and the MacGyver, the new reboots of those, I think you'll really like The Equalizer. It's a lot of fun. She's great in it, but I don't think it's like groundbreaking TV by any means. So anyway, that's what I watched in the last couple weeks.
Cool. Okay. I can remember the Pajama Case Girl because I haven't seen it for years, but I remember being disappointed with it because it wasn't a typical giallo. And I think rewatching it now, I'd probably have a different take on it because I know it was so atypical of what, the Black Glove Killer kind of movies I was kind of craving at the time. It's also got an interesting parallel, hasn't it, between 10 to Midnight, because that was based on true...
Sort of, yeah, that's right.
So interesting. And obviously The Uninvited is always a pleasure. It's kind of one of my go-to movies when I, want to have a fun evening with some trash in the best possible way, as in like trash in a good way, rather than talking down the movies. Which reminds me, we did have. I just want to bring it up there very quickly that Joseph sent through a rather hilarious review on YouTube about saying from somebody saying, "Please delete your channel because you trash talk all these movies." And just in our defense, we don't, we do this from a place of love. I mean, to be honest, we'd be pretty soulless, heartless people to do 10 years, or in my case, coming up to 25 years of a website. And the same with Joseph and, with Erik, of kind of watching his films if we hated them,
And that comment was on Silent Night, Deadly Night Part 2, which we all agreed had some good parts to it.
If I could just incorporate as a longtime listener, I don't think that they understand what trash talking means, because there are plenty of cynical podcasts and websites out there, and they're really bad, and they don't last, and they don't keep an audience because of that. And I was just talking about this, ironically enough, with Bill Ackerman yesterday, because something popped up on my radar that falls into my purview. And I don't want to say much about it because I don't want to bad talk somebody, and I haven't listened to anything that they've done. But the whole point of their existence is to make fun of things that I'm interested in. And so I was texting with Bill about it. And I was saying one of the things that I love about the Hysteria Continues is you guys did both Rob Zombie movies. And I remember the second one better because it's more recent. And of course there was a lot of going off the map there because, you were drinking. But I remember how respectful you guys are actually of the film. And I know you're not big fans of Rob Zombie's Halloween films, but you're always very clear to be like, this isn't like we think Rob Zombie, there's anything wrong with him or anything like that. We just don't necessarily care for his kind of filmmaking. And I think you guys are very clear about when something like that happens, not tagging filmmakers personally. I think that you offer legit criticism about films, both good and bad. And not every movie is going to be the best movie ever made, And I know with my podcast, I try to do that because I think TV movies get really maligned, and so maybe I go over the top with it. I don't think you guys do. I think you have a really nice balance with it. So like I said, I don't know who that listener is, but maybe there's some other podcasts he should be checking out first before he says that, because I can't imagine anybody saying that about your show. So it's not even so much that you've been doing it for 10 years and you're committed, but I think as a listener that's been listening for a long time, what I'm getting from it is nothing like what that person is saying. Do you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, but it just made me laugh, the comment, because it was kind of almost like an impassioned plea, which I thought was quite funny. So I'm not sure it may have been tongue-in-cheek, but I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, Joseph.
We get the serial thumbs downer, and occasionally we'll get the comment like, "Oh, I think you're way off base on this. You guys should stop." But I don't know. I don't really take it seriously. It's kind of humorous.
Exactly. We have fun with this, and that's like you say. I think that's why we kept going for 10 years, because we enjoy doing it. And also we try and get a balance between respecting the films and having fun with them, because that's kind of a lot of the intention of these films. I mean, 10 to Midnight is, when we talk about it, whether or not it was actually intended to be entirely serious, I don't know. So, well, thank you, Amanda. I say The Equalizer of not, I remember the Edward Woodward one from the 80s, so presumably this is a kind of reboot, is it, with Queen Latifah in there?
Yeah, it is, and it'll be interesting because I don't have much of a relationship with the original Equalizer. I don't remember watching it when it originally aired. I have the pilot. I haven't seen it yet. And I know I've seen an odd episode here and there, but I think when it came out when I was a teenager, I was more into lighter stuff. You know, I wasn't watching shows like that. There was another show like that with Ken Wall, and I can't even remember the name of it. Wise Guy. Like, I wasn't watching those shows, and I think I'd have a greater appreciation for them now. So I can only talk about what I think Queen Latifah is doing in the context of the film of today. Unfortunately, I can't. But I don't know if you guys are fans of The Equalizer. Maybe you could help me when we get to that part.
I don't know if Erik remembers, but I remember Equalizer being quite a big show in the UK in the 80s.
It was a big show, yeah, but I never watched it. I know my brother used to watch it all the time, but I didn't. I didn't even know what the premise of it was, to be honest. I didn't know it was a vigilante-themed TV series.
Yeah, I've got vague. I haven't seen it for a long time, so but I can imagine it's kind of, if I remember correctly, it's very kind of TV time, kind of watered down violence kind of thing of like a bit like Murder, She Wrote, so you have a murder each week and you have a vigilante.
I don't think Jessica Fletcher was a vigilante, was she?
If anyone was going to be fingered, it would be Jessica Fletcher.
Oh, Justin!
What?
Oh my goodness.
No, but it's kind of like the fact is she's always, there's a murder and, how after a while you have to point the finger at someone, don't you? If they're at the scene of a murder, and it's not just that she's like a detective you can understand, like Cagney and Lacey or someone like that. That's understandable. But if you're just a mystery writer, just wherever you turn up, the supermarket or wherever, and someone's murdered, you have to think along those lines eventually.
She is kind of a vigilante. There's this really great episode with Elliot Gould where at the beginning of it, they've got this woman, like they're interrogating her, like at her house. And they're like, just admit that you murdered him. And she's like, I didn't. And Jessica Fletcher at the end of every episode, when somebody confesses to a murder, and you can't see it on Skype, she makes this really judgmental face and kind of shakes her head. Like, tisk, tisk, tisk. And so she's kind of like, I know you did it. And I'm like, what are you doing? So at the end, so there's this really great scene where she's walking out of the house with Elliot Gould and the police have this woman behind her in cuffs. And the woman is hysterically crying. She's crying for her innocence, right? And Jessica Fletcher's like, so I'm in Arizona for a couple more weeks. Where should I visit? And Elliot Gould's like, you should go here. And then the woman ends up committing suicide, which we find out later is a murder. But I'm like, oh my God, you drove this woman to her death. So she's as close to vigilante punk as you can get on 80s TV, I think.
Yes, definitely. Well, it's a shame if they did a kind of Blumhouse kind of redo of in the same way as they did Fantasy Island and turn it in a complete different direction. Then I can imagine a vigilante Jessica Fletcher. But anyway, but thank you, Amanda. Erik, is there anything you've been watching?
Well, I watched a few other J. Lee Thompson, Charles Bronson collaborations from the 80s that I discovered. I've seen Death Wish 4 before, but I watched that again. Good fun. And I watched Evil That Men Do, which the film they made directly after 10 to Midnight, and one called Murphy's Law from 1986, which was good fun because the lead character was called Jack Murphy, who's the name of a very good friend of mine. So it made it kind of fun to watch. But they'll probably crop up in conversation as we're discussing 10 to Midnight, so I won't go into them. But and they're not horror either. But I was in a Twitter listener party last night, Tim's Twitter listener party for the Blow Monkeys with Amanda. So I spent 45 minutes listening to the Blow Monkeys' second album, Animal Magic, for the first time, tweeting along with people. Amanda was very enthusiastic. It's a very big album from her youth. So that's what I was doing last night. Yeah. And I think Dr. Robert from the Blow Monkeys liked one of your tweets as well, didn't he, Amanda?
He liked several of them, and the weird thing is he liked our, because I went on and I tweeted about when the album was done playing, I tweeted how much I enjoyed the listener party and having Dr. Robert there listening and having Erik as well. And then Erik went on and said, oh, we'll be chatting tomorrow about 10 to Midnight. And I said, oh yeah, I've gotten some notes about the history of the vigilante film. And then Dr. Robert liked that.
Yeah, he liked that tweet, which I thought was weird.
And I'm like, is he really into vigilante movies? Because
maybe he's listening now. Hello, Dr. Robert, if you are listening.
I hope so. He liked a lot of my tweets, but I was kind of like tagging him a lot, and I was really, really gushing because I couldn't figure out a better place to do it. So, yeah, I kind of went overboard. But I love that album, and it was a lot of fun to have him explaining where the inspirations from the songs came from. And that's not horror at all, so that's all I'll say about it.
Toya has done a listener party as well, as has Susie. Well, I don't think Susie was involved, but they did a Susie and the Banshees album. They did Kaleidoscope, Justin. You should have joined in.
Ah, well, if I'd known about it, let me know if they do another one.
I think, Steve Severin or Budgie or somebody might have done the tweeting. I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, that sounds like fun. So, yes. Well, thank you, Erik. What about you, Joseph?
Yeah, the only thing I watched this week was the new Netflix true crime series. It's called Crime Scene: The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel. It's about the Eliza Lamb case. If you're not a true crime fan, you probably won't know who that is. But myself, I'm not necessarily a true crime fan. I find some of the missing person cases interesting, and I found this one interesting enough to where I wanted to hear the definitive word on what happened to this girl who basically goes to this sketchy hotel in the downtown Los Angeles on Skid Row, and she ends up disappearing, and they find her body floating in one of the water tanks at the hotel like 2 weeks later. And the documentary, it's 4 hours long, and they could have told this story in like 30 minutes. What they do is they bloat the runtime with like, history of the street, Skid Row, history of the Cecil Hotel. And they spend a large amount of time on, conspiracy theorist YouTubers who think that this girl was murdered when, the police basically just, say, hey, it was just an accident. And all the evidence points to being an accident. And, I wanted to spend more time with that angle, what really happened, what led her to this hotel and all that stuff. And they just spend way too much time, listening to people theorize about, I think a murderer was there and blah, 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 blah. And they even ruined some guy's life over it. And it angered me. I thought the documentary was unfocused. I found some of the stuff about the hotel itself and where it's located. I found it interesting, but it's not really what I signed up to watch, so I didn't enjoy the documentary. It's very popular right now because it's new, and everyone's talking about it, but I wasn't a fan. But if you are into true crime, you might enjoy it. It's very slick looking. I'll give it that. But it's called Crime Scene: The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel. Any of you guys seen it?
No, but it is front and center of Netflix when I log in. It's like the top thing you see when you log in. Is that the case of that, that famous CCTV footage of the girl in the lift and she looks like she's having an argument with somebody who we can't see? Is that
that's Eliza Lamb.
That was really creepy, that footage.
Yeah, I mean, it's easily explainable, and they explain it down to a science, but it's just like they gloss over it. They don't talk to the girl's family. I mean, I could understand they probably don't want to talk, but still, they spend so much time on people I don't care. I know I would just not like in real life, that I was just like, just get back to what I want to talk about. But, they just didn't. It was just a waste of time, honestly.
Have you seen it, Amanda?
No, I haven't. But when he was talking about the photograph or the footage of the girl in the lift, it made me think about, I grew up in Las Vegas, and in the 80s, I can't remember the name of the person, but they made a TV movie about him with Gerald McCraney. That I've never seen. I don't know if I can watch it, but he killed like 20-something women in the course of his spree. And he came to Vegas, and he went to this mall that I used to go to all the time called the Meadows Mall. It's by my house. This had been in like the late 70s, early 80s. And he went to one of those fashion shows, one of those like back to school shows where like the local kids who modeled, like the really beautiful local kids. And he went to a fashion show, and there was a girl that did one of the runway walks modeling some clothes from one of the stores, and a photographer took a photo of her. And in the background is him watching her, and she was murdered by him. And they found her body like 2 years later in the desert. And at the time, the photo circulated in our local paper after she disappeared. Because the photographer, when he processed the photo, he recognized him, because this was a guy who I think he'd already been sort of identified, but they couldn't catch him. And I don't remember the whole storyline. And but I never forgot that photo. And it really upset me, because he's just watching her, and that like later he's going to kill her. And he became really famous because he kidnapped a girl. Maybe Joseph remembers this. And he took her with him on his spree, and she helped him. And it was because she was kidnapped, and I think had been brainwashed. And at the end, when he was getting really close to being caught by the police, he let her go, and he took her to the airport, and he put her on a plane and sent her home. And then he killed himself in a gas station parking lot, or maybe he was getting gas and the police were coming, and I think he shot himself. Do you remember that, Joseph?
No, I'm not familiar with that case. I'm not a huge true crime fan, but a couple of the mysteries are kind of interesting. And I thought, everyone was talking about this, so I watched it. But ultimately, I read about a couple of these and I tend to forget about them unless they're like so bizarre that they just stick in my head, but most of them don't.
Oh man, I was so into true crime. Like in the 80s and 90s, I used to be a member of the True Crime Book Club, which every month you would get this like hardcover book of true crime. And I got books like The Eyeball Killer and all the like Richard Ramirez books. I don't watch the documentaries. Like the older I got, the harder it was for me to kind of read and watch those things and not think about the victims. But when I was younger, I was really fascinated by it. But this is the story I don't remember, or I don't know if it's newer or not, but I don't recall it.
I watched the document. I kind of binge watched it in the background while I was doing other things. And it's directed, wasn't it, Joe Berlinger?
Berlinger, yeah.
Oh, who did Blair Witch 2?
It's associated, produced by Ron Howard. So it just goes to show how big true crime has got. Obviously, I also watched The Night Stalker, the Richard Ramirez thing on Netflix, which I thought was much better than this. And I kind of agree with you, Joseph. They kind of stretched out this kind of story, but this incident and the disappearance. It kind of I found the stuff kind of quite heartbreaking and interesting about Skid Row, and the socio-political stuff going on there, and how they've the history of how they basically turned it into almost like an Escape from New York style thing of putting all the homeless people in a square mile block and kind of keeping them there. And the history of the hotel, but it was kind of also they spent so much time with these kind of these online sleuths, the kind of and it's almost like 2 episodes just on them talking about how they're sure there's something going on here and she was murdered, blah blah blah. And then the thing where they decide that this black metal musician is her murderer, and they go after him, and he has this breakdown, and he's had nothing to do with it, and they get offered complete impunity. I thought was the fact is it spent 2 episodes with basically these people that are so wedded to their conspiracy theories about what had happened, even down to the fact that there was a TB outbreak at the time on Skid Row a couple of days after she'd gone missing, and they'd called the name of the investigation or the project to help it was very similar to her name, and it's just crazy conspiracy theories. And at the end, most of them had to say, "Oh, yeah, it was just an accident." So it kind of felt not anticlimactic, but it was also I wasn't quite sure what the point of the documentary was really. It would have probably been, more of an unexplained mysteries for like half an hour or 45 minutes or something like that. And it ended up being quite sort of sad and a bit depressing, really, the whole thing, because it was making entertainment out of this woman's mental breakdown, and then the irony, of course, they're making that point by making a Netflix documentary entertainment out of it. So it's got different layers. But again, you could say the same thing about horror movies and films like 10 Midnight and the themes in that. When you have a film that condemns films that condemn certain things in society, but then also exploit them for exploitative reasons. It's kind of there's this kind of weird duality with that, which is interesting, but also kind of quite complex.
Yeah, they take this sad case and they sensationalize it to the nth degree, and you feel bad watching it almost. It's kind of wrong-headed almost. I don't know. I'm just a simple, give me the facts. I want the logical evidence, and I want to know what's going on kind of guy. The fact that these people, they targeted this black metal musician, and they ruined his life to the point that he almost wanted to commit suicide, and then they don't even apologize to the guy. It's just so aggravating, and they spend two episodes on these people, and I'm like, ugh. Yeah, I finally had time to watch something, and I wasted it on that, so I'm kicking myself.
I think I was surprised when I saw it. I thought it was going to be like a series of different cases, rather than when it got to the end of the first episode, I realised actually it's all about this one case, and 4 episodes. I couldn't see how they could stretch out or why they would even do that. With the Richard Ramirez and Night Stalker series, it kind of made sense because it was quite complex. Although that was more interesting in so much, again, they didn't focus on his background or much about him at all, really. It was all about the victims, which was more interesting and more affecting in a lot of ways. It didn't kind of glorify him as a person, which I think is sometimes, like true crime, can be sort of guilty.
Yeah, that's the problem with it. It's like Ted Bundy is way more famous than the people he murdered, and there's so many problems with that. As much as I love true crime, I recognize that that's really bad behavior, and that's just so pushed by the media, and we see that all the time. But Richard Ramirez was also in my childhood, so he was really fascinating to me. I've read everything about him, and I'd be curious to see this documentary. That's one of the few new true crime things that's popped up that I've really gotten an interest in. I just haven't gotten around to watching it.
It was interesting. I mean, one of the things, just kind of very briefly, is that I listen to I do listen to some true crime podcasts, or the ones that are not necessarily true crime, but they kind of look at sort of dark history and things. One is Hollywood Crime Scene. I started listening to, and they had a recent 2-parter on Richard Ramirez, but they spent a lot of time talking about the women that loved him after he got convicted.
Yes, I saw women get into a fist fight over him on a talk show.
And I think when the man had his teeth were rotted to black pegs, weren't they? The halitosis alone would have been, and it's just kind of crazy that they were like these kind of, and they said it was like another mental issue that these women had I can't remember what it was, some dissociative disorder or whatever. But I found that kind of fascinating. Of course, it's not alone, is it? It's not, Manson and all of those. Ted Bundy had it as well, so it was an interesting phenomenon.
None of them are as hot as Jeffrey Dahmer, so I don't know what anybody's talking about.
But they said that he didn't have male groupies. But interesting. Well, when we do get to 10 to Midnight, it'll be an interesting discussion to talk about how the fact is that you've got this kind of hot serial killer who's naked most of the time, and women don't want anything to do with him, and it's just kind of a weird. And some of the reviews.
Maybe it's because he's not hot.
Well, in your opinion.
Maybe we should make that a talking point, because I think that this movie, and I didn't make any notes on it, but this movie is making commentary about this sort of world that women have to live in, where they're constantly the object of some guy. And sometimes it doesn't matter how good looking you are. You're just a fucking creep.
Yep.
No, that is absolutely. But I just think it's this idea that he's, if he wasn't such a creep, he wouldn't have a problem.
Oh, probably. I agree.
But it's interesting, sort of. But anyway, we'll talk about that in a minute. I'll just kind of quickly mention a couple of things that I watched. I watched I haven't seen it for years, but the Innocents from 1961 with Deborah Kerr, which is kind of the most famous film adaptation of M.R. James's Turn. Is it M.R. James? I think it's the Turn of the Screw.
Yeah. No, is it? No, it's a Hardy. Is the last name? Isn't it Hardy the last name of the author? It's not M.R. James. Thomas Hardy, maybe?
And it was so well done. It was, I love that kind of very, very atmospheric. And the reason I mention it is because I've been putting off watching The Haunting of Bly Manor on Netflix, because I really like the director's other stuff. And I enjoyed the series before that, which I can't remember what was that called? The Haunting of something other. The other one he did, but The Haunting of Bly Manor was kind of, essentially it turned out to be like a 12-part adaptation or whatever of Turn of the Screw, and I just kind of thought, again, talking about eking stuff out, eking subject matter out over a too long a time, and I do wonder sometimes, it's kind of, do you really need to have a 8-part or 12-part adaptation of something that is not, you can easily make a good adaptation in 90 minutes. And so going back to that Elisa Lam documentary, do you really need 4 parts? And is it really more about providing content than quality? But I haven't seen The Haunting of Bly Manor. I wonder, did anyone catch that?
No, who's the director that you're talking about?
Mike, I can't remember his last name. It's Mike. He did Oculus.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I saw the first episode of the first series. I think it was The Haunting of Hill House. It had Victoria Pedretti from the second season of You. And I got one episode, and I realized, it's like 10 episodes long, that they're just going to drag this story out of, someone hears something go bump in the night, and they're going to drag it out for 8 episodes. And I'm like, I want to know what that noise is now. I don't want to wait till the 8th episode to, figure out something, simple. Like you said, a lot of these shows on Netflix, they stretch them out, for at least 8 to 10 episodes when they could tell it in 2. So I lose interest,
And time is precious to me, so I don't indulge in these miniseries at all. Mike Flanagan is his name.
But he did Hush, which I don't know if you saw that. That was good about the deaf woman being menaced by a psycho. Yeah. So I think he's really, and is it Absentia? I think his first film.
Absentia is so much better than Hush, in my opinion. If you haven't seen it, it's really good.
Well, that's good. Oculus about the haunted mirror was pretty good. But The Haunting Hill House, because obviously that was a remake of The Haunting, from the Shirley Jackson book, the original, and it was kind of really went off in a different direction. It was bounced off that really, rather than sort of a direct adaptation. No, actually, I thought it was really well done. That was actually, it kind of worked. It kind of made sense across that time period. It's just I couldn't really see how you could do Turn of the Screw across 8-10 episodes, but then I will get around to it eventually, I am sure. So
I like the last episode I recently seen was like 6 minutes long, and this one's like 36 minutes long.
Gosh, yes, I know. Well, just imagine if our dear Nathan was here. Well, Erik, are you going to bring us back in?
Bronson plays Leo Kessler, a cynical Los Angeles cop on the trail of Warren Stacy, a homicidal maniac who turns rejection from beautiful women into the ultimate revenge. When the legal system sets Stacy free, Kessler plants evidence to put him behind bars for good. But Kessler's plan backfires, leaving him with only one option: to hunt down Stacy on his own, before the crazed killer strikes again. 10 to Midnight is a Cannon film, which automatically draws my attention because I am a fan of the Cannon output of the 80s. I think nobody did medium budget action films like they did around this time. What I love about 10 to Midnight is its kind of unpretentious nature, and also its the unique hook it has, which is a killer going around with his arse hanging out and making obscene phone calls. There's two elements in the film that already will have me drawn in. Not that I particularly like this guy's arse, but I think it's just an interesting conceit to have a nude killer. That's something we hadn't seen in Friday the 13th or My Bloody Valentine or Halloween. And I love the Charles Bronson is very much stereotyped around this era. I mean, he's basically playing his Death Wish role again, although in Death Wish he's an architect, whereas in this one he's a cop. But again, he's got this no-nonsense approach to the law, and he just focuses on giving the bad guys their just desserts, to hell with the consequences. Not that there ever are any consequences in these films. I mean, Charles Bronson never gets prosecuted for working outside of the law. So this film it's a kind of a cop/serial killer movie along the lines of Dirty Harry, although the fact that the killer in this one is very much in the mold of maybe like Joe Spinell in Maniac gives it that sort of slasher edge, which is why I think it shoehorns quite nicely into the slasher genre. He's portrayed as being purely evil. I don't think there's any redeeming qualities to the character of Warren Stacy, which is convenient as our hero Leo Kessler, played by Charles Bronson, isn't the most sympathetic hero. I mean, he's so determined to get the bad guys that he's sort of blinkered to everything else around him, including his own daughter, who he seems to be quite cold and heartless to for much of the film. But we still kind of root for him because, we're so disturbed and put off by the killer himself. I love the 80s vibe in the film. I mean, giving that killer that amazing Spandau Ballet fringe is a great starting point. And that's probably why, looking back, I would not consider him attractive. I think maybe if he cuts his hair, maybe something might change for me. But that fringe just doesn't work for me, I'm afraid. Even though it is very 80s and I love Spandau Ballet. But and I love the opening sequence where he sets up his alibi. I thought that was quite clever, although possibly far-fetched, where, he makes a nuisance of himself in the cinema, then sneaks out to kill some nudie people in the nude, and then creeps back into the cinema, making it look like he was there all the time. Very clever. So what could have been then a by-the-numbers cop thriller is given a real jolt, I think, by some other wonderful WTF moments. As I said, the killer being naked. Primarily, it seems to avoid leaving any evidence, so that he doesn't get any bloodstains on his clothes and that. But also, I suppose, as a manifestation of his sexual frustration. Coupled with that, we get some juicy dialogue as the killer adopts a Mexican persona, and he makes really obscene phone calls that wouldn't be that wouldn't be amiss, or they'd feel right at home in Black Christmas. He uses some really obscene language, and maybe that's why Nathan hasn't joined us this morning. Maybe he found the language too objectionable, and he just had to say some Hail Marys or say his prayers to try and cleanse his soul. But he says really dirty stuff. He says the C word, Justin. That's the most forbidden word of all. The piece de resistance, though, for me is, and it's a famous scene, is Charles Bronson waving around some kind of pneumatic masturbation device that he finds in the killer's apartment, and it looks like a prop from Videodrome. It's just a very strange looking thing. It's like, I don't know, it's like a Black & Decker drill with some kind of fleshy attachment at the end. It's very strange, and it's probably not something. It's probably something actually that you might find in Justin's bedside locker.
It looks like the anal intruder from Top Secret. It's like this giant jackhammer with this big rubber dildo on the end of it, almost.
Hours of fun. Yeah. So I mean, like with a lot of these sort of cop films, particularly these canon ones from the 80s, it's a very dated attitude where the cops have the ability to work outside the law and act as vigilantes without really getting punished for it. And I know that the politically correct stance on this is to say that, vigilantism is wrong and they shouldn't be doing it. But I think there's kind of a real audience satisfaction achieved when you see the bad guys get their comeuppance by any means necessary. So, I mean, I don't agree with vigilante justice, but I do like to watch it on screen in films like this. I just, it's that 80s action movie shtick that I just really like, where Rambo or Arnie or somebody will just mow down the bad guys with a machine gun, and there's no question about, will he go to prison for this. I think the scene where Warren Stacey attacks the nurses is really well done. I think it's this film's version of the raft scene from The Burning, where sort of a large swathe of the cast are sort of killed off in quick succession, and I think the scene is really well directed and executed, and I think the bit with Laurie hiding under the bed is as good as a similar scene in Torso where Susie Kendall is trying to hide from the killer. I think it has that sort of tense nature to it, and that scene is generally quite intense, I think. So I mean, I love this film. It's a huge thumbs up. I mean, I know it's not 100% a slasher, but there's a feature. I have the 88 Films Blu-ray of it here, and there's a featurette on it where somebody, I can't remember who it is, Mike Malloy talks about what's called the cop sleaze movement, where he talks about films like Cruising and Vice Squad and Tightrope. And I'm not normally a huge fan of cop movies or thrillers, especially the more serious ones, recent-ish ones I wouldn't be mad on. But, having nudie killers and Charles Bronson waving elaborate electric willy machines around certainly makes it more alluring to me. And I love... As I said, I love canon movies from the 80s. I mean, even their less well-reviewed ones, I think, work for me on some level. And this one, I think, is terrific. So yeah, 10 to Midnight is a big thumbs up. It's a slasher movie, it's a cop movie, and it has enough silliness and seriousness, I think, to it to make it well worth a watch. So Amanda, did we invite you on here for 10 to Midnight because you were a big fan of this movie, or
I don't know.
Oh, right. Well, let us know. Are you a big
Charles
fan?
Bronson fan?
Oh yeah, I am a big Charles Bronson fan. Yeah, and so those movies that you mentioned, Eric, at the beginning, particularly Death Wish 4 is my favorite Charles Bronson movie, and I know everybody's like, what? But I love that one because he's like the bumbling vigilante, and he gets caught at every turn in that film, and then he has to kill the person that catches him. So like there's that great scene where he's in that guy's apartment who lives in this high rise, and the guy comes home and he's like, what are you doing? And Bronson goes, making a sandwich, and then he throws him out the window.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
It's great. And he has to blow up those guys in the restaurant with the wine bottle, and after he's been found out, you're not a wine salesman, and so it's like, it's brilliant, and it's really fun. And it also has a skating rink scene. And you mentioned Murphy's Law as well, which I really like because of Kathleen Wilhoit as like the punk rock kind of.
Oh, she's great. Yes,
buddy.
She's so cheeky.
she is, you snot licking, whatever. Like she just has like these really horrible things she says over and over again, and it's amazing. And he did. I know this era of his career is not his favorite era. Particularly for these films, I think some of his TV movie work he might have been more proud of. He did a movie called The Seawolf, which I think is a adaptation of a Jack Lord, is that his name? Novel with Christopher Reeve that's quite good. But Christopher Reeve said that working with Charles Bronson was very difficult. And I don't think he thought Charles Bronson was difficult per se, but I think he thought his style of acting was not typical of how actors prep. And I think he was just into give me the script and I'll memorize it and I'll just come out and what I do is what I do. And Christopher Reeve is very much a very highly trained actor. And I don't know all of Charles Bronson's background on how he came into acting, but I think his approach was a lot more lackadaisical or laid back, or maybe not as methody as some actors especially from the 80s. But I think that his 80s output is fantastic. But what I find so interesting about this film, and I'm just going to briefly go into it, is I found this essay online by a man named James Kendrick. He wrote something called A Genre of Its Own, From Westerns to Vigilantes to Pure Action, where he kind of takes a look at action movies from the 60s to the 80s and maybe into the 90s, where he talks about the vigilante film and how it kind of grew in popularity in the 70s as an extension of the Western, which at the time was kind of dying out. And he said that the major difference between those two subgenres was that the setting usually obviously took place in gritty urban landscapes as compared to, these Western landscapes from period piece time settings. So the roots of the police procedural actually began in 1948 with Naked City, which takes place in New York. And Kendrick wrote that it paved the way for these sort of detailed police procedurals like we see here. But it was the French Connection from 1971 that created the sort of map that the genre would follow. And those included two major elements in that there was gritty location photography and the step-by-step procedural process for solving crime. But also it introduced the cop buddy formula that involved an older cop working with the younger one. So we see all of this in 10 to Midnight, right? And so Kendrick doesn't mention this film particularly in his essay, but I was really struck by a lot of stuff he said about this time period. So he said that the major shift from the Naked City into the 1970s was that Naked City offered some reassurance or hope at the end of this film, whereas the procedural genre of the 70s was a lot more pessimistic. Two of the major points that would be handled in these types of films was corruption and criminality. These essentially demanded vigilantism, right, in the film. And something Kendricks wrote that I thought was really profound was he said that in these movies, the city wasn't just crumbling, it was already crumbled. And then he quoted a man who was a scholar named Garrett Epps, who said that these movies of the 70s were actually neo-fascist, by which he meant that they, quote, show a frightening sophistication in the half world of sadism and authoritarianism, which is the breeding ground of fascist mentality. So basically, he's stating that these films are giving sort of a green light for police to do whatever they need to quote unquote, keep the peace. So we can look at Death Wish, I think, as Bronson's most signature film of this sort of vigilante subgenre. So he's not a cop, but Paul Kersey addresses these sort of dystopian landscapes by using violence as a way to exterminate other types of violence. And interestingly enough, and I never made the connection when I watched Death Wish, was that the film's connection to the Western is actually rooted in Kersey, played by Charles Bronson, going to this ghost town and seeing a stage gunfight while he was visiting Tucson, Arizona, like in the middle of the film. And it never even occurred to me that that was the connection. And that's what sort of leads him to deciding that he's going to get this gun, which he picks up in Tucson, and start killing all these people based off this crime that happened to his family. So we saw this kind of branch off into all kinds of movies like Miss 45, Rolling Thunder, Vigilante, of course, with Robert Forster. And then by the 1980s, the action film grew bigger, enjoyed larger budgets, and there was less concentration on protecting society. And then it became a thing that was stemmed from a protection of, I don't know how to word this. It was from personal needs rather than Beverly Hills Cop is a good example of that because that's actually where he goes to Beverly Hills on a vendetta. Also, I should mention Beverly Hills Cop also starred Lisa Eilbacher, so that makes it kind of interesting. Who's also she plays Charles Bronson's daughter in 10 to Midnight. So, and then of course, when you think about Die Hard, so of course he's saving everybody in the building, but it's really because his wife is being held captive there, right? So it becomes more personal as compared to being more public, I guess. So these films also became simpler in their narrative and more intense in their action. But I think 10 to Midnight is actually sort of a hybrid of these two types of films, the vigilante film and the vendetta film, which we saw in the 80s. So what it's doing is it's mixing the 1970s ideological framework of these films with a more glossy blueprint from the 1980s. And so I think it could be seen as both a vigilante and a vendetta film. So to me, I think other interesting aspects of the movie is that 10 to Midnight is a movie where the character sort of degrades his work ethics to uphold his moral ethics. Meaning that he's willing to sacrifice his job in what he thinks is upholding society or keeping society safer. So he lowers himself to the same level as the killer, and he even takes on similar traits, meaning he's doing these things that the killer's been doing to his victims, right, to terrorize him, which is fascinating. And I love the way he turns the tables on him. But I think it would have been really interesting to see this movie in its original run because I would be curious to see how the audience would have reacted to this sort of stuff. Because I think in a more nuanced film, we might be asked if we're being complicit in this. Meaning, if we're cheering on Bronson, even though he's taking on the same sort of how do I want to word this? Even though he's taking on the same traits as the killer, what is that saying about us as an audience member? Are we excusing depravity because we think it's taking on a greater good at the end? And I don't think that 10 to Midnight is looking over that, but I don't think it's as ingrained in the kind of commentary which I think we might have seen in the 70s in something like Death Wish, which is also a really interesting movie because I'm always fascinated by foreign filmmakers who make movies about Americana, and gun violence and gun control and even just owning a gun is so American that to have a British director like Michael Winner come in and make commentary on that is really fascinating to me. Here we've got a big director. I don't really know where J. Lee Thompson's from, but I mean, he's did Cape Fear, I think, originally. And to have him do these kind of gritty cop films is really interesting to me. And then there's other elements of the film I want to talk about, but maybe we could talk about real quick the equalizer here in that in this reboot of the show in 2021. What is so interesting about it is that it's more morally upright. I don't think it's asking the same questions that Death Wish or 10 to Midnight is asking, in that she's always on the side of good, and I don't think she's lowering herself to any kind of lower standard. I don't know how to word that. It keeps running around in my head, but I don't know if that makes sense. But it's like I think when you watch the new Equalizer, she's completely moral, and there's no questions about what she's doing to save the person that she's trying to save, as compared to these other movies that I think mixes in a lot of commentary and a lot of things where we have to ask ourselves if it's okay to like this person or to cheer them on. Here, she's just completely like the White Knight, right? And so there's not any gray area that I can see. And I kind of feel like that's where 2021 and this modern sort of idea is going. I think we're losing some complexities in certain types of films, but I'd have to see more of them to be completely 100% on that. But that's how I felt about watching Equalizer. Not that it's not great. I thought it was a lot of fun, but it's definitely sort of whitewashing a lot of these questions that I think the 70s and 80s films were asking. The other thing about the movie that stood out to me was that it's a commentary on performance. And maybe we could talk about the women in this film afterwards. But so when I say performance, what I mean is we're always performing, right? So like how we are at work is going to be different than how we are at home, or how we are with certain members of our family, or how we are with our partner, or how I am on a podcast compared to how I might be, when I'm at the grocery store. So is there commentary about Davis's character, the killer? Because I'm under the impression that he might be gay. And I'm thinking that the film is saying that one of two things: either his need to perform as a straight man has led him to this sort of point of madness. And is that saying something negative or positive, in that when we're forced to repress something, is that what leads us to these acts of madness or to these criminal acts? Is this what drives us crazy? Or is it just saying that being gay is bad? And because he's gay, he's going to do bad things. It's unclear to me. But the thing about his apartment is that there's, you see in his apartment, there's a magazine with like a naked man on it. Also, Bruce Lee, I know, can sometimes be a gay icon. Like, for instance, I have a very close friend who's gay, and he's in love with Bruce Lee. And I think Bruce Lee, for a lot of men, is very attractive, and for women, don't get me wrong. But his apartment is kind of cluttered with these sort of images that lead you to believe that he's more attracted to men. And it makes me think of Marjoe Gortner in Earthquake, which is a whole other thing. But I think that there's some commonalities between their characters in the paraphernalia that they keep in their apartment, and also these acts that they perform later on. But we were talking about women in the movie, and what I think is so interesting about women is so, like, there's a scene, I don't know how well you remember Miss 45, but there's a scene in Miss 45. So she's a mute, right? And she's going to lunch at the beginning of the film with her coworkers. And as she's walking down the street in New York through the garment district, there's all these guys kind of lined up along the wall, and they're like, hey, baby, hey, just smile, baby. And she can't respond to them because she's mute. But that's generally how women feel walking down the street, right? We're always on guard. And especially in the 80s and 90s, I think now we're understanding how really toxic that was. Women were constantly being harassed by men. And this film kind of shows this sort of constant harassment that happens, not just with the girls in the theater and not just with his victims, but later when the killer is, they have to acquit him because they found out that the evidence was planted by Bronson. He gets to go back to his job, and he has to work with this secretarial pool where all the women are terrified of him. And so every day when he walks through the office, they all stop and stare at him, and they're terrified. And that's sort of a day-to-day existence for a lot of women. And I think it's a really interesting, subtle thing that he's ingrained into the film, J. Lee Thompson, in that he sort of understands what it's like to sort of walk in those shoes every day. And there's a lot of interesting commentary about women. We may talk about the girls at the theater are really interesting because they're both opposite of each other. The chubbier girl is kind of interested in him. And later when they're at the lineup to identify him, the more buxom, more idealized beauty girl says, you know, he was sitting next to me. And then the other girl says he was sitting with us. And there's this idea of wanting a man like that, even though he's sending off all the red flags to be attracted to you, when you fall into that camp of the women that might be considered less attractive. And I hate even saying that because I think that actress is adorable. But there's a lot of commentary about women and their day-to-day existence around men like this in the film as well. So I think 10 to Midnight is actually kind of a layered film. It's asking a lot of questions. It's a lot of fun at the same time. I know I'm taking it off into another path here, where I'm inviting maybe more of an academic look at it. But it's a fascinating film on top of everything else. And he looks really good naked. So I think it's a great film, and I give it a thumbs up too.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And as usual, an incredible in-depth analysis there that puts us all to shame. Because my analysis of the film is he's nude and he says bad things on the phone.
Well, real briefly, the thing about the phone that I'm really fascinated by is that phones in 80s cinema kind of trigger gender dynamics. And I guess in the 70s too, when you think of Black Christmas, but usually in these movies, a man calls a woman and he is the aggressor and the woman is a passive object. And in certain the only film I can think of that rearranges that map is Eyes of a Stranger, because she starts making the calls, right? And then Bronson does it here too, and I find it fascinating. He's basically rendering the aggressor as the passive object. Right. So the phone calls are actually really important to the film too. And it's something I didn't touch on, but it's been in my mind a lot lately about how the phone is used in these films to render the woman as an object. And they very seldom turn the tables. Here, Bronson has to do it. A man ends up doing it. And I find it really fascinating. But that's all I want to say about that part.
Okay, just one thing about you. You mentioned that Warren Stacy is possibly gay. There was a scene in the script that wasn't filmed where Warren is approached by a gay man who starts flirting with him, and Warren sort of aggressively rebuffs his advances. Doesn't kill him, but he does call him the F word, the one that rhymes with maggot. So I think there definitely is intentionally something going on there. whether it's a positive or negative portrayal of a gay man, and what it's still ambiguous, I suppose. Joseph, I think you're a fan of 80s action crime canon movies. 10 to Midnight float your boat?
I've never seen a canon film, actually.
Have you not? No.
Yeah, 10 to Midnight's amazing, actually. I love that this film has this cold opening with Charles Bronson. He's basically, this is Reagan era action at its best, because this cold opening, Charles Bronson is like, he's like, I'm a cold, tough son of a bitch, and I always get my man. He's setting himself up as this macho hero of this of this film, and yet he's neutered. He's boxed in this office, and he's behind a typewriter. He's not out there shooting bad guys like like it's typical of Charles Bronson, because now everything's run by bureaucracy, and he's here to kind of cut the bureaucratic red tape and go out and gun down anyone who would be a perceivable harm to society. So it's got that dynamic going. But I love Gene Davis as Warren Stacy. I mean, to me, he steals the entire movie. He's so good as the smarmy kind of me bad guy. The cat and mouse between him and Bronson towards the end of the film, when Bronson decides to throw away his career and go after this guy single-mindedly, it's basically this chess game between the two. Warren Stacy will lure the Kirsty character into, or whatever his name, Leo Kessel, whatever his last name is. He has almost a similar name as he does in Death Wish, so I get him confused. But he'll lure him into a trap, or then Bronson will call and emasculate him, like Amanda said. And so it's like this back and forth, and then elsewhere you've got this slasher story going on with Warren Stacy in the nude, and he's going around killing all these I guess women he perceives to have slighted him in some way, or won't have anything to do with him. So it's like this mishmash of the genres. And for me, there was in the early 80s there was this a couple of films that tried to mix action or martial arts with the slasher film. You get Silent Rage, but for me, I find this infinitely better than Silent Rage. On a technical level, on an entertainment level as well. I love the scene where Warren Stacy's in the movie theater because he's got these two girls in this movie theater, and he's basically just kind of being like a pig, just to kind of give himself an alibi. But I wanted to know what movie they were watching.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Okay,
because I must have missed that, because I think they make a big deal out of it, and for some reason, maybe the copy I was watching, they didn't mention it, but everybody was making a big deal out of it. But anyway, I love that scene. I love that setup where he's able to sneak out, like you said, Eric. He goes into I think it's the bathroom, and there's like this hatch over one of the toilets, and he just climbs out, goes to the park, kills this couple in this van, and he sneaks back in, and he starts acting like this slovenly pig again. But like I said, this is like total Reagan era, nonsense filmmaking at its best. You got someone like Charles Bronson coming in to brutalize criminals with an iron fist, and you've got Warren Stacy as this kind of hey man, let's go do whatever we want, kind of I'm naked, I'm going to let it all hang out, kind of killer there. And so you get these two on a collision course, and it's just very fascinating to watch. Very well directed, very well shot. I love the scene at the end where Warren Stacy comes in to attack all the nurses as he's looking for Charles Bronson's daughter. Like you said, it's sort of like The Burning. It's this film's The Burning raft scene. It's all done in like a 30-second succession. Like he comes in, stabs one girl, immediately corners another girl, and then stabs another one, and then the girl he's after basically just kind of has to hide in the apartment. She has to hide. She has to sneak out. She has to distract him with noises. I mean, it's just this tense game of cat and mouse until Charles Bronson catches up with him at the end of the film, and they have this kind of back and forth. He's like, I'm sick. You can't punish sickness. And then Charles Bronson gets that last line. I mean, I don't know if it's a canon film. Let's just get that out of the way. It's a canon film, so I don't know if you're necessarily supposed to be questioning your own morality while watching this. It's really just kind of, for me, it's just passive, shoot 'em up entertainment. And it's done so very well that, all the moral questions you might ask yourself watching these two go head to head. For me, I just kind of pushed it out of my mind and just watched this chess game, and it's an exciting chess game, and it's it gets my thumbs up, both thumbs up. So yeah, 10 to Midnight, great film.
Excellent. Justin, are you a fan?
I'm kind of mixed on this one. I think. I mean,
What?
yeah, no, there's lots of I do like, but before I talk about that, just one thing I just want to pick up on about the kind of the gay aspect to this, putting it in the kind of context, because it quite why they did that, because it's like you say, it sounds like a script or that was meddled with, and there was obviously more. Erik mentioned the scene that was cut. And it kind of reminded me of a similar kind of scene with Michael Biehn in The Fan, where he actually kills a gay man. So, but in the context of this kind of time, you had like films like Cruising with Al Pacino, and then The Windows, the kind of lesbian version. They both came out a couple of years before this, and so where homosexuality was seen as kind of kind of an aberration, I can guess. And so in kind of real life, the serial killers don't tend to kill outside of their kind of their own ethnic group, or also you don't get gay men killing women for a start. It doesn't really happen as far as I'm aware. So it's kind of this, and I just wondered if it was done as a way of kind of allowing the intended audience, which presumably was intended to be mostly, sort of action fans, straight white men, I kind of guess, for want of a better term, to feel like a bit of a get out clause with this. It seemed to be a bit fudged. That's
oh
right
dear,
word for
we wouldn't choose a better word than that.
That wasn't intended, but so that was kind of interesting. I think the idea and where the idea came from, the naked killer, because obviously one of the probably the best known trivia about this film is the fact that they had to shoot two versions, which isn't unheard of. They did it all the time in Eurocult films in the 70s, of kind of naked and clothed versions for different markets. But the headache they must have gone to, that literally they had to shoot a TV version with him wearing skimpy black Speedos or underpants throughout the film. But you get so much more male nudity in this. I mean, not just him, you do get at least two other male asses throughout the movie. Obviously you get a lot of topless scenes, but when it comes to the distribution of nudity, it's quite a brave role for him to be playing, because from what I can tell, he's not got any, he's literally is naked. You do get a few flashes here and there of his genitals or bits bulging out backwards when he's sort of leapfrogging over something. So it's kind of quite a brave choice. And again, how that would have played with the intended audience, I don't know. It's interesting that they decided to go down that. Having said that, ultimately, I think there is a canon film, and it's not made as a social commentary, although there can be social commentary taken from it, and as you did, Amanda, and I think as ever brilliantly. But first and foremost, it's a film made to capitalize on Charles Bronson's Death Wish persona, ongoing. But it's also, the other thing that I find kind of interesting in this is it's another one of these films that we talked about when we did the commentary for Silent Madness recently, and the early 80s slashers, Alone in the Dark, and a lot of these films take a very dim view of mental health professionals. And so although they don't say this in so much in this, it's this idea that you've actually, it flips it, that you can have these lawyers who just basically will get anyone off and don't care. And so even though you've got a mass killer, the lawyer's going, I'll get you time. Well, it wasn't another. But so that I thought was kind of interesting. Of course, the irony, of course, is that in the Reagan era, we're talking about this being a Reagan era kind of action or slasher movie, is that Reagan was the one who pretty much threw most of people with mental health problems out of asylums and placed mental health facilities across the United States. So
that's not all he did in the 80s.
Well, not all he did, but it kind of flooded the streets with people with mental health issues. Not all of them were dangerous, obviously, but so it's kind of, there's a complexity here. Having said that, you can also watch it as, quote unquote, a bad fun movie, in so much the some of the acting can be a little arch, especially the scene where the woman who runs the typing pool finds out that one of her secretaries has been murdered.
I love that scene. I can't believe I forgot to mention. She's like, "Oh no,
Betty's dead."
Betty's dead.
She just comes out, and just makes this big announcement.
And it's kind of, but also the film, I'm sure when we get into background, also shamelessly kind of steals. I mean, it's the Richard Speck murders of the 8 student nurses from 1966 is being recreated. That, of course, that was also recreated shamelessly in the 1972 Jallow Slaughter Hotel with this. This kind of using that kind of true crime, those real crimes. There was another crime that kind of had an influence, a different aspect to it, which I'm sure we'll touch upon when we go into background.
That's interesting because, Richard Speck, when he was in prison in the last couple years of his life, was taking hormones to become a woman. And that's kind of it wasn't happening, I don't think, at the point that this film was made, but we were talking about, I think you're right when you say it's interesting your thought on that making him potentially gay is an out for the male audience who would be watching this film. And I find that fascinating. And I think you're also right that serial killers, I'm thinking about it, I can't, like Jeffrey Dahmer killed men, Ted Bundy killed women, but it is interesting that Richard Speck, I don't know what his sexual orientation was, but I do know I have seen footage of him with breasts. And by the way, you can't unsee that once you see it. But it's really upsetting because he was like a pock-faced, really, really jarhead looking guy. He looked very much like a man. And then one day he was in women's lingerie with boobs. And I was like, what? And so it's kind of interesting that this takeoff of that would feature a guy who may or may not be gay, based off a true crime of a guy who was transforming into a woman before he died. Sorry, just a connection I made just now when you said that.
No, well, that's interesting. I didn't know that about him. Did he have a sex change in prison?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the whole story. I think he was taking hormones, and they must have been okayed by somebody in there. Somebody's going to look that up, and I'm going to be totally wrong. But my memory is that there's famous footage of him, which I have seen, and I think I saw it on one of the true crime shows from the 90s, where he was doing something to transform his body, and he was also doing a lot of drugs at the time too. And I think he had a heart attack. And the ironic thing was, I remember reading an interview where he had to be sent to the hospital, and I think one of the nurses at the hospital was like, nobody wants to take care of this man because he killed 8 nurses.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll touch more on, I'll talk about the other crime that influenced this film. But one thing I just want to mention, one of my favourite moments in this was so on the nose that made me laugh out loud, was when the killer goes and finds out about Betty's diary. Of course, Betty was the first victim I think we see in this. And he hears about the diary, so he sneaks into her bedroom and breaks open her bedside table. And inside is a box written in big letters, "My Diary."
Yeah, why would you keep that in the box? Just to build suspense for that scene. It's dumb.
Hilarious. But we haven't spoken. The only other, obviously. His daughter, I think, is Lisa Eilbacher, was pretty good in this. I mean, she was believable. Andrew Stevens, of course, is the sidekick. Who because you've got this whole thing of him faking this evidence to convict him. Although I rewatched it today, and I'm kind of, although it seemed that although he was the killer, and obviously we know as the audience he was the killer. How Charles Bronson knew for sure that he was a killer, it seemed to rest mostly on him having a pneumatic fleshlight in his bedside table.
Well, he had a hunch. He's based off that hunch. I got a gut feeling. Screw red tape. Screw going by the book. Screw evidence. I know this guy's guilty, so I'm going to do whatever I can.
But he didn't have any. There was no evidence, was there?
Not really. No.
Nah, it was circumstantial. He had the diary, and he had the photo of him. I don't know how that photo really played in, that Lisa Eilbacher brought over and gave to Andrew Stevens, and that's really all I can think of in terms of evidence.
Well, it just seemed to me that he could have been just the wrong, it wasn't that film, but it could have been that he framed the wrong person.
Just like the black metal guy from that documentary you were talking about.
So it wasn't like, I thought if the film could have made it like Charles Bronson, he got off on a technicality or something, the killer, and Charles Bronson was going, I'm really going to go after him. But just because it was a hunch, it seemed to add a different level of whatever to it that...
Well, I think it's more like, if Charles Bronson, if it was like a technicality, it would be like black and white. But this is more gray area. There's this kind of moral conflict between the two. They're both doing something wrong, on different sides of the law. I think that's what makes this interesting, actually.
No, I agree. I agree because it doesn't make it as clear cut. Although, really, obviously, by the end of the film, because obviously the ending, which I'm sure everyone's seen, is that you have this killer who is probably mental. He probably is. He is obviously insane, or I've read somewhere in the one synopsis that he'd been released from an asylum or a mental health facility. He'd been for 6 months. I'm not sure if that was made clear in the film or where I read that.
I didn't get that impression from the film at all.
I didn't pick that up in the film either.
But I did see that in the synopsis on it, and I did. So I wonder if that was the case. But he'd obviously been, if that was the case, that he'd been released back into society, and he got this job in this typing pool, which seemed a strange.
A really interesting thing too. Sorry, I hate to keep harping on this, but when they go to interrogate him in his apartment, Bronson asked him how well he knew Betty, and he said, "I knew her as well as the other girls," which I thought was a really interesting line.
Yeah, well, it could be taken either way, couldn't it? It was kind of the other girl. I knew how she knew the other girls, or how I knew the other girls.
Well, it was like he was likening himself with the girls, right? And so, I don't know. I'm just stuck on this stuff in the movie, like these little clues, but I can't figure out whether or not. I like what you say about like the potential of him being gay gives the audience an out to not make themselves completely complicit with the killer, right? Because that's who they would identify with if the audience is largely white male. So anyway, it's just, I'm going to write a paper on it. That's it.
Well, like one thing that keeps on, I keep on getting this mental image now when we talked about, because obviously, the films that came out, this kind of treads a line. I mean, one of the contemporary reviews, and I got someone basically says Charles Bronson does Friday the 13th, which isn't quite true, but it's, it has like that kind of popcorny feel to it. But we talked about Joe Spinell in Maniac, and I keep on, in my head for some reason, keep on getting visions of Joe Spinell in this running naked. If it had been somebody like a Joe Spinell character in this, rather than, arguably conventionally attractive man, is kind of would that have given it a different dynamic? I don't know.
I think it would. I think
would. I mean, I think the point is that he ticks off all the boxes physically for a ideal mate, but then he starts talking, and then you're like, oh my God, there's something completely wrong with this person. And almost every girl, with the exception of the girl at the theater, the less attractive one, and I don't know what the commentary is there, there are red flags everywhere, and they notice it, and they're completely turned off by him. You know what I mean? And I think that's a really interesting statement.
Which is, it's that nudity thing just is kind of adds. And also one other last thing I'll just mention is when he was running that scene, the opening, well, not the opening murder, the main murder scene with the kind of passion wagon where Betty and Herb date in the park, and he's, as Erik mentioned, it was kind of somewhat unlikely that he could sort of disappear out of the cinema and go and find them somewhere in the park, and then get back. But could you imagine running naked, not just naked, but barefoot through a forest?
Yeah, I was thinking about that when I was watching her run. But I think he'd been watching them because there's this scene before he gets to the theater, while he's in the theater, where you see him looking through the window at them. So either he'd followed them that day and knew they were going to be there, or they go there all the time. It seemed like a flashback to me.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that was the case. But then, of course, logic. Who needs it?
Yeah, sorry.
So, well, shall we talk about some background?
Well, before we do that, one thing I wanted to mention, one of the criticisms I saw lobbed at this film was that it was dumb, and I don't think it is. They mentioned specifically the Andrew Stevens character and how he's useless to the plot, and I don't think that's true, because you need the Andrew Stevens character as this kind of moral compass for the Charles Bronson character. I mean, he's the one link, other than his daughter, he's the one link to keep him grounded to, reality. And that's why Charles Bronson, towards the end of the film, he confesses to the judge that he planted the evidence. Obviously he had his own motives there going out after the killer outside of the law. He wouldn't be bound by the law, but it does show that he does have a moral conscience. And I think it's because of the Andrew Stevens character. And in a dumb film, it would be just, Andrew Stevens would be a sounding board for him to, say, well, this is what I think the killer's doing, Mr. Stevens. And he'd just be someone to talk to. But no, Andrew Stevens, he has a purpose in the film, is what I'm trying to say. And to call that dumb, I think you just kind of misinterpreted the film.
I'd agree. I also think you can juxtapose him against the killer, right? Because women feel much more relaxed around him as well. It's not like all young men have the potential to be like horribly violent, but I think he does. Yeah, he shows that he brings Charles Bronson around ultimately, whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but he's on the side of good and he's trying really hard to follow a moral ethical code, which also can be juxtaposed against Bronson's pattern.
Yeah, he doesn't condemn Bronson for what he's done, but he's conflicted about it as well.
Yeah.
He's I'm trying to think of the word I was going to use there, but I like that the Andrew Stevens character, like you said, Amanda, I like that he's kind of the opposite of the Gene Stacy character, because he's the no nonsense. He's the red tape in the story. He's, Charles Bronson's daughter, is flirting with him, and he's just like, he's kind of like the just the facts, ma'am, just the facts type cop. And I think that's interesting in contrast to Bronson, who's the, I'm going to shoot you if you even look at me cross-eyed kind of cop. So you got those two, you get those two dynamics, and I think that's very interesting. And one last thing, sorry, before we get on the background. In the Charles Bronson, filmography, it doesn't pay to be any relation to him. Like, if you're his wife, forget it, you're dead. If you're his daughter, you're going to be you're going to be stalked. If you're his neighbor, you're probably going to be get a punch in the mouth. So if you know Charles Bronson in a movie, your best bet is just to move to another state.
This is absolutely true, particularly in the Death Wish movies. I mean, he's had a trail of tragedy left behind him.
It was his maid in the second one. I mean, it was so ridiculous. It was like, his maid. It wasn't even like a family member.
Yeah.
Although I guess something happens to his daughter at some point, and I don't like Death Wish 2. That one crosses all kinds of lines. I have a real hard time with that one.
It does. It's quite grim in places. Yeah. Death Wish 3 just goes off on its own bizarre little tangent.
So
it's like Class of 1984 meets Death Wish or something. There's something very alternate dimension about Death Wish 3. So background. Anyone have any background they want to do? Joseph? No, Amanda, of course. Sorry, as our guest.
Well, yes. I don't really have background on the film per se. I just have background on Golden Globus.
Yes, please. We love Golden Globus.
Just to get us started, the Golden Globus era began in 1976 with a movie called Diamonds, which is an Israeli heist film. And I'm only mentioning their second film because I think it has some interesting connections. So they did their next project was called Passover Plot. Which was notable because Paul Golding worked as the story consultant. And so Paul Golding only ever directed one feature film, and that's Pulse from 1988 with Joey Lawrence. It's a really, really good movie. And the movie also starred Zalman King. And so I'm not sure if this is where Zalman King and Golding met, but they would go on to write a series of scripts, tons of them apparently, that were all optioned but never produced. And you can find one of those scripts on Paul Golding's website if you're curious about their collaboration. So by the time 10 to Midnight was released, Cannon was the biggest independent in the business. Screen International wrote an article about the Cannon formula, and they basically stated that the company was one of the first to successfully work in production and distribution. And by 1982, they were buying a chain of cinemas in the United Kingdom. So part of the formula was to hire well-known actors in the leads, of course. And they said that was the best way to compete with studios, since the average moviegoer usually didn't know something was a big studio production or an independent. So as long as you put a famous person in it, they often just thought it was like all the other films coming out. So this was their way of camouflaging their indie status. And of course, they had major marketing campaigns that competed very well with the studios. And they also had very strong relationships with foreign markets all over the world, which helped them move their products overseas better than some of the studios did. And of course, they were also really interested in variety. So we talk a lot about their action movies, but for 1983, their slate of releases were films as diverse as things like Duet for One with Faye Dunaway. They did a movie called Mata Hari with Sylvia Kristel. And they even were going to produce a movie with Eli Wallach and Elliot Gould that was called Albert and Elizabeth, but that one never materialized. And even House of Long Shadows was in the planning stages by, I think, 82 or maybe early 83. So in May of 82, I think, I don't know when 10 to Midnight went into production. I think it came out in 83, but even by May of 1982, they'd already sold 10 to Midnight to foreign markets, along with 12 of their other titles. The deal was made at the Cannes Film Festival. It landed them an 8-figure check. And some of the films included in that pack with 10 to Midnight was Sword of the Valiant with Sean Connery and that Championship Season with Bruce Dern and Martin Sheen. So you can see they were just all over the place at this point. And I also read in an article that in 1982, it would appear that 18 films in total were announced to be in production at Cannes, and by January of 83, they had already finished 15 of them, which is amazing to think about. And the MPAA in February of 1983 awarded 10 to Midnight with an R rating. Other films to get an R rating that week were Joysticks, Monty Python's Meaning of Life, and Private School. And then I found 2 reviews of the film that were kind of polar opposites of each other. Richard F. Shepard of the Los Angeles Times wrote, "If 10 to Midnight, the new Charles Bronson film that opened yesterday at the Rivoli and assorted neighborhood houses, is not among the worst of its kind, then it is because its kind is among the worst of any kind." Kim Newman of, where's my Variety review? Variety gave it a really positive review, I'm sorry, and I didn't clip that one. Kim Newman, though, did review it for the Monthly Film Bulletin, and he wrote, "With the axiomatic Charles Bronson as a reactionary cop, 10 to Midnight perpetuates the current yoking of the policier with a threadbare psycho movie, bedecked with TV-style soap operatics and a sheen of professionalism." I wish I'd clipped that Variety review. Variety thought it was a really, really good film. I think they compared it not to Hitchcock, but to some of the other better filmmakers of that part up to that point in film history. I also want to mention that Darren Sarafian, who directed To Die For, appears in 10 to Midnight, but I didn't recognize him in the film. I don't know who he plays. Sean Schweppes, who played Peg, who's the buxom girl's friend at the movie theater, was in Terminator. She was also Blanche's overweight daughter in The Golden Girls, and she would go on to write the Pauly Shore comedy Son-in-Law. We didn't mention that Kelly Preston is one of the nurses that gets murdered at the end of the film. And the black actress that's in that scene at the end, her name was Ola Ray. She played Ola. She's actually in Beverly Hills Cop 2, which I thought was funny because Eilbacher, who plays Charles Bronson's daughter, starred in the first film. And she was in another Eddie Murphy movie too, 48 Hours. But she's best known for playing Michael Jackson's girlfriend in Thriller. Robert F. Lyons, who plays the lawyer, I think he's the district attorney. He was in Dark Knight of the Scarecrow, of course. He played Skeeter. And Wilford Brimley was in The Thing. And Lisa Eilbacher herself was in both Bad Ronald and This House Possessed. So there's a nice horror pedigree in this. And that's all the background I have.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Amanda. Joseph, do you have anything for us?
Yeah, actually, I got quite a lot here. 10 to Midnight, as of February 11th, 1984, was number 16 in the top 30 video cassette rentals. At that point, it was on the charts for 5 weeks and sat during the previous week at number 15. So that would place its rental release as early as January of 1984. Actually, it debuted at number 23, and then it climbed to number 20 in its second week. And my research between the second week and the weeks 5 and 6 is kind of missing, but it appears to have debuted on the bottom rung of the top 30 ladder, but it climbed a little during its ultimate run in that top 30 there. In the May 26, 1986 issue of Newsweek, they take an extensive look at Cannon films, and they list some of their lowlights underneath the Golden Globus banner. And 10 to Midnight is listed amongst 2 other slasher films, 1980's Schizoid and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2 from 1986. Those are the lowlights from Newsweek. But on the flip side of that, in a 2015 issue of Sci-Fi Now, they listed it as number 2 in their 10 must-see Cannon films list, trailing The Apple for some reason. That was number 1. I don't know why.
Hey, The Apple is awesome.
Yeah, the apple is awesome. But it was also amongst other luminaries like American Ninja, Cyborg, Life Force, Ninja 3: The Domination, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2 again. One of the things I love doing is looking back at old program schedules or, TV guides or even those old guide channels from cable and spotting movies that I love, when they were playing. And in 10 to Midnight's case, American Cable Systems, which is located in Marion, Massachusetts, they put out an advert in the Mattapoisett Presto Press on June 6 of 1984, advertising a slew of films coming to their programming schedule under the byline A Cure for the Summertime Rerun Blues, with 10 to Midnight listed along with Jaws 3. Eric, I know you're a big fan of Jaws 3.
Yep.
There's no air date, but my guess would be mid to late July or early August of 84 is when it went to pay stations, because typically these films would occupy rental stores for a good 6 months before making their way to the pay stations. I do know that it was run on Channel 9 in Antioch, Illinois at 7 o'clock on Halloween night in 1986. Let's see, it played again. It played on Showtime in Boise, Idaho at 4 a.m. Mountain Central Time, and then again on March 7th of 1980. April 15th of 1988. The first one was 1986. This is 88. Again in Boise, Idaho. Now, I assume the Showtime airings ran concurrently in other time zones, as I don't believe that movies were region allocated at the time. I think whatever Showtime was playing is going to be shown across the country. I could be wrong on that, but it's probably one of the first showings I actually saw. And I have a slew of TV and radio spots for 10 to Midnight, and one was for a Channel 7 in Australia sometime in 1989 that I found very interesting. It was the Wednesday at 7:30 movie, and it was edited for content. I love looking back on all that old stuff. Joe Bob Briggs, he listed this in his top 10 of 1983, and he nominated Charles Bronson for the Best Actor for the 1983 Drive-In Academy Awards. HBO's 1990 Guide to Movies on Video Cassette and Cable TV gave 10 to Midnight 4 stars and said it was Vigilante Bronson at his best. On the flip side, but not very surprising, Roger Ebert gave this 0 stars, and he said, "This is a quote-unquote, this is a scummy little sewer of a movie, a cesspool that lingers sadistically on shots of a killer terrifying and killing helpless women, and then is shameless enough to end with an appeal to law and order. The people who made 10 to Midnight have every right to be ashamed of themselves, and that includes Charles Bronson, whose name on the marquee is the only reason anybody would come to see it." And that's all the background I have on 10 to Midnight.
Excellent. Thank you, Joseph. Justin, do you have any?
Yes, apparently one of the things I thought that was quite funny was that when the actress Ibacker, what was her name, Lisa Ibacker, was, I think she's being interviewed by Johnny Carson or somebody. It was about a different movie, and she told a story about 10 to Midnight, and she said that Gene Davis wanted to break the ice basically with the actresses because he was going to be spending so much time nude with them. So he walked around sort of nude, trying to break the ice, which must be very awkward. And he said Lisa Ibacker says she refused to stare at his member, and so he tied a red bow around it to get her to look at it. So which I thought was interesting.
Yes, I did read that.
What a lovely gift.
Just a lovely package. Obviously, director J.D. Thompson, of course, was known for The Guns of Navarone and the original Cape Fear. But of course, to slasher fans, had made Happy Birthday to Me a couple of years, or it made it the year before this. The one thing I did find interesting, they were saying that several other people, and I'd be interested, Amanda, to hear whether or not this would have floated your boat. The 2 other people who reportedly auditioned for the killer's role. One was Parker Stevenson.
Hello.
Imagine him with his butt hanging out.
I have.
And the other was Leif Garrett.
Yeah, maybe Parker Stevenson. That's interesting because Parker Stevenson starred with Lisa Eilbacher in the Hardy Boys. She worked for their father on the series, her character. And then years later, they cast her and him together as love interest in This House Possessed. And when I interviewed him recently for my This House Possessed episode, he said that he was pretty sure that the casting people kind of knew that they knew each other, that there was an association with them. And he thinks that might have played a part in them both being called in for to audition for the roles that they ended up taking. So it would have been kind of another element would have been added. I can't imagine Parker Stevenson doing nudity, though. I've never known him. There's a movie where I think you're supposed to see his butt in Stitches, but I'm pretty sure that it's a body double because I've watched that part. Yeah.
Well, actually, I must admit I made a mistake because it wasn't actually. Parker Stevenson was up for the role that Andrew Stevens got.
Oh, that makes more sense. That makes more sense. I would love that. But I think Andrew Stevens, I mean, I love Parker Stevenson and I wish he was in it. But I think Andrew Stevens is kind of an underrated actor. I think he's actually very good.
Yes. Well, the other person I did see linked with, said had auditioned for the role of the nude killer was Alec Baldwin.
Oh, yeah. Sign me up. Young Alec Baldwin is climbing the wall already thinking about it.
So a couple of other bits. It was one of the other things that apparently Gene Davis got so into the role that he dislocated the shoulder of actress Ivor Lane during the scene where he's shaking her on the bed, which must have been very, not very nice for either of them, I would have thought. But the other things I've got a few bits were that this was released in some areas the week after William Lustig's Vigilante, which of course was another film that came out with that whole vigilante thing. You had other films like The Blackout and of course The Exterminator 1 and 2, which again played with the vigilante themes. Canon put out some publicity for this and kind of in some ways it not made me laugh, but it was tried to sell it as a serious issues film, and apparently one of their publicity said 10 to Midnight is a taut motion picture that touches on a serious and sensitive issue surrounding our judicial system.
It does touch on things, I'll admit that.
Apparently the original script was called Bloody Sunday, and it was changed to 10 to Midnight, although 10 to Midnight, I think probably by one of the Canon people, but of course it has no reference to anything really, does it? There's no 10 to Midnight in the movie. There's nothing.
That essay that I read, I think, wasn't that essay? I read a review and they likened it 10 to Midnight to being evocative of High Noon, showing that it does have comes from a Western sort of background.
That could be the case. I mean, I saw some contemporary reviews, which I'll touch on a few of them, who kind of said they couldn't really see what the connection was. The talked about the murder. We obviously talked about Richard Speck, the murder of 8 student nurses, and of course, Ted Bundy was possibly an inspiration with this as well, the kind of good-looking killer. But the other connection was the one I'd never heard of before. It's the Towpath murders in London in the early 1950s, where 2 teenage girls were murdered with a hatchet, and the police were framed or were. There was a quite sensational trial at the time where one of the policemen had planted evidence was sure that the killer was who he thought he was, so he planted evidence to get him convicted. And there was quite a sensational case around that at the time. And that apparently seems to be a little bit, has been cited as inspiration for the Charles Bronson's character doing kind of similar. One thing I thought was quite funny, they've got a few reviews here. I'll just go through a couple of little bits. Well, one from the Pittsburgh Press said that every patron in the cinema was between 55 and 80 for this movie, which I thought was interesting. And he said in the review, he suspected it's because they'd all come to see a Charles Bronson movie. And that he said that kind of the youth set, which of course had driven the success of the slasher movie throughout the early 1980s, it didn't really turn out for this movie, which, as you said, Joseph, the film wasn't a box office smash, was it? It kind of grazed the top 30 and went up a little bit, but But just a couple of the reviews, and I found some. Surprisingly, mostly it was lousy reviews, as you probably imagine. But there were a few good ones dotted in here, and I'll just go through a few of them. In the Detroit Free Press, he said, "I like Charles Bronson movies. In a lot of ways, I liked 10 to Midnight. It doesn't give me any pleasure to admit this, however, because the movie is based on a premise I despise, the right of cops to behave like vigilantes. Watching this film is like watching a bullfight. It may be fascinating, you may be swept up in its passion, but afterward you feel diminished and dirty. And the audience cheers at the end represent a public approval of corruption that I find unbearably sad." The LA Times said, whereas 10 to Midnight is a slickly made, suspenseful and scary movie, it is also inflammatory and extremely dangerous, which I thought was interesting. Again, we've talked about this lots of times before, that how these films had a certain, I wouldn't want to say power, but a sense of danger to them, whereas now we may look back at them with a sense of nostalgia and some cheesiness in some of them. But at the time, many people saw them as highly, inverted commas, problematic. The news pilot said a reviewer can take up a lot of space pointing out the low values 10 to Midnight has, but Bronson fans could care less. Even I will admit the biggest attraction to me was seeing Charlie give to the bad guys in his other death movies. The Morning Call noted the music and said much of Robert Ragland's musical score sounds like a rip-off of John Carpenter's eerie accompaniment to Halloween. The Pacific Daily News, I read somewhere that Charles Bronson had plastic surgery for this movie. I don't know if that was because he was 61 years old when he made this, and whether or not that was just one of those urban legends. But the Morning Call, the Pacific Daily News says Bronson has never been worse. He looks, sounds, and acts uncomfortable, as if he tried to extend his range and realised he was out beyond it. And I did see another little thing I saw mentioned was, I can't remember who was one of the Canon guys took Charles Bronson. It was Jill Ireland was his wife, wasn't it? I think. And they went to see the movie at a showing, and they went to a sushi restaurant to have something to celebrate. And this guy, who I forgot to get his name, said Charles Bronson looked miserable. And he thought, cheer up, Charlie, it's not a bad movie. And he says, no, it's a good movie. I just hate sushi, which I thought was quite funny. Just a couple of other ones here is the Baltimore Sun, and this is where it gets a bit more positive. It says 10 to Midnight turns out to be a proficient piece of rabble-rousing, right-wing movie making, and if its politics will strike many as utterly spurious, its technique is never less compelling. Politics aside, a good part of the charm of the film lies in its simple professionalism, so rare in the bargain basement exploitation movies. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette called it nasty but engrossing. It mentioned that it said that Gene Davis was too good-looking to play a schmuck driven to kill because he's rejected by women. And it said, yet Davis, a well-built, good-looking actor with a passing resemblance to Richard Gere. And of course, Richard Gere would have been kind of one of the big heartthrobs of the time, I imagine. The last couple is the Atlanta Constitution gave it a good review. It said it's several cuts above your typical slaughter and revenge movie, and said the script is pretty clever. The last thing I think I have here is the Tampa Bay Times said, when it's not butcher block brutal, 10 to Midnight is tediously predictable, unsparingly sensational. Its cheerless finale is based on the retrospect slaughter of 8 Chicago nurses. So it certainly was something that was recognised at the time. So that's all my background.
Excellent. Yes. Okay. Well, I'll just chime in with a few more things. That J. Lee Thompson, in collaboration with Charles Bronson and his wife Jill Ireland, as you mentioned, and producer Pancho Coner, they'd bought the rights to a novel called Evil That Men Do, that I mentioned earlier, and that was supposed to be the film that they were putting into production in 1982, but there was some backroom shenanigans that temporarily put that project on hold. So Menachem Golan went to Cannes 1982 and just sold a film concept called 10 to Midnight. He'd got a poster, a hand-drawn poster made up to flog over there, and it pitched the film as being a kind of an international terrorism movie, because they hadn't a script or anything yet. They just had Charles Bronson and the title 10 to Midnight. So when they got back to LA, they had that project that you called Bloody Sunday, was also known as Bloodbath. They had that story, so they just retitled that as 10 to Midnight, and that's what the project went on to be. Another person who auditioned for the Andrew Stevens role, but he probably would have been more appropriate for the killer role, was Sam Bottoms. You were mentioning Gene Davis's, not Gina Davis, Gene Davis's brother. He's the younger brother of Brad Davis, who was in Midnight Express. And Gene Davis had been in Cruising, actually, which we've mentioned a few times. As we mentioned, 2 different versions were filmed for nudie scenes so that it could play on cable TV. Apparently, if you watch any of the full-screen VHS versions from the early 80s, you'll see, because it was filmed open matte, you'll see his underpants in a lot of scenes. Gina Tomasina, who plays, I can't remember the character's name, she's the girl who's killed when she's trying to, as she's making breakfast for herself in her apartment. She became famous for being one of the 3 ladies in the ZZ Top videos of the 80s. Gimme All Your Lovin', Legs, Sharp Dressed Man.
Yeah.
She's one of those girls that goes around that incredible car. The film, you were asking when did the film go into production, Amanda? It was filmed over 8 weeks in November and December of 1982 in Santa Monica. Now, is Santa Monica, is that anywhere near Santa Chandler? No? Nobody?
Is that your
Santa
joke
Monica,
of the week?
Santa Chandler.
Oh,
no.
haha, I got it.
Yeah, that's good,
So,
isn't it?
You mean like Santa Rachel and Santa?
Santa
I can't remember the other
Joey,
two.
Santa Phoebe. Yeah. So that's when it was, and it was released in March of 1983. So quite a quick turnaround. Another case, I don't know if you've mentioned this case yet, but another case that possibly inspired the Warren Stacy character was a case I'd never heard of called Jack the Stripper, which was a series of unsolved murders in London and that were never solved, and people, or the police, sort of deduced that the killer was naked when he was doing the murders, because they never found any evidence of any kind of clothing or fibre at the crime scenes. So that's possibly another inspiration.
I've never heard of Jack the Stripper, but I've heard of Jack the Tripper.
Wah, wah. I love Jack the Tripper. I think Jack the Stripper would be really interesting. I've never heard of him. When was that?
It was, I believe the 1960s. I haven't written it down here, but I think it was the 1960s. Some stage. So the film opened in 595 theaters on March the 11th, 83, and made $3 million in its first week. Its budget was $3.5 million, $1 million of which went to Charles Bronson. So he was earning a pretty penny. I mean that's a nice salary for 8 weeks' work. So the final gross was $7.2 million, which is kind of less than half of what Death Wish 2 had collected the previous year. Which had been a big-ish hit for Cannon. In June of that year, it was playing double bills in drive-ins with the Chuck Norris film Forced Vengeance, which I haven't seen. Have you seen that movie, Joseph?
I have. It's
any good?
It's okay. It's not one of my favorite Chuck Norris films, but it's okay.
Yeah. Unbelievably, this film was passed uncut by the BBFC in February of 1983 for cinema release, but video versions were heavily cut after that by 1 minute and 42 seconds, mostly for the copious nudity, and then also many shots were removed from the nurse massacre scene. Although the Blu-ray that's out now is the full version, so you can rest assured on that. And I think that is all I have. Oh, the masturbation device that the killer possesses was custom built for the movie, but is based on similar products called the AccuJack or VacuJack, which themselves were inspired by devices used to extract semen from horses for artificial insemination. Don't
just gloss over that.
This is, I have to say that there's a brilliant commentary track on the Blu-ray by the author Paul Talbot, who has written.
I know Paul.
Do you know? Is he a friend?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm Facebook friends with him. Yeah, he's really interesting. He wrote a book on Bronson, I think.
Yeah, he's written 2 books. He's written Bronson's Loose and Bronson's Loose Again, which look at mainly his 80s stuff. So he's an expert on 10 to Midnight, and his commentary on the Blu-ray is brilliant. It's on the Scream Factory Blu-ray in the States as well, and it's really interesting. So he's that. The guy with one line, I think he has 2 lines in the film. He's at the party scene, and he inquires about the gun that Andrew Stevens has, that guy. His name is Kyle Edward Cranston, and he's the brother of Bryan Cranston of Breaking Bad fame. There we go. Oh, the guy in the medical lab who's caught smoking pot, His name is Paul McCallum, and he is Charles Bronson's stepson, and his birth father is the actor David McCallum, who he looks actually very like, same hair, I think. But he's also a musician, and he provided music for 2 later Bronson movies, Murphy's Law and Death Wish 4. And actually, that scene that he's in that medical lab, that's the same hospital that was used for Halloween 2. I haven't written down the name of the hospital, but it's somewhere.
It was Haddonfield Memorial.
Haddonfield Memorial, that's it. Yes.
I was saying, you're talking about his son. It might be interesting to note, too, that Jill Ireland had a pretty torrid affair with Michael Winner before she met Bronson. And then he would go on to work with Bronson heavily. And they stayed really good friends. But they had, I think, a pretty intense love affair, too.
Wow. Yeah, well, Michael Winner did like the ladies. Yeah. And Jeffrey Lewis, who plays Dave Dante in this, he's a recognizable face from films like Human Experiments and Night of the Comet, but he's the father of Juliette Lewis. I didn't realize. So there we go. And that is all the background I have that has not been mentioned. Yes.
Excellent. One thing I just forgot to mention, and it's just as an aside, is obviously Cannon made, I think, Joseph, you listed some of like Schizoid and obviously the Hospital Massacre, aka X-Ray. So Cannon was kind of known for dipping its toe into the slasher trend. But one of the lost slasher that was never made was, of course, Lover's Lane, with Wayne Newton of Las Vegas fame as a killer on Lover's Lane, which was going to be a Cannon slasher that was going to appear and be shot in 1981, which never happened. So what we saw really by 1983 was a bit like you saw with the Giallo, with the turning into the Polizioteschi genre, mashing them up with What Have They Done to Your Daughters, those kind of movies where you have a bit of a Giallo and you have a bit of a Polizioteschi movie. And so you see this with something like 10 to Midnight, that J.D. Thompson's gone from Happy Birthday to Me, which is very much a teen whodunit slasher, to this, which is kind of police procedural vigilante movie with some slasher elements. So the subgenre, even by 1983, was kind of rapidly changing, either going to the kind of supernatural territory with films like The Slayer or Nightmare on Elm Street, or those kind of movies, Deadly Blessing, or going to different directions like the sort of Silent Rage, or the kind of the Chuck Norris movie. So sort of interesting times, but. Wow, that's what an epic.
What an epic.
But talking of something perhaps that won't be so epic.
It's my joke of the week. It's so bright and fantastic.
Okay, this was kind of last minute, okay? So, why was Warren Stacey so aggressive all the time? Because he was really bummed out. I had another one, okay? Did you know that 10 to Midnight was originally conceived as a sequel to The Lone Ranger? It was going to be called Tonto Midnight.
I would have called it The Bone Ranger.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Well, do we, Joseph, do you want to tell us, what people have been saying on Facebook about this movie?
Okay, out of 77 votes, 88% of those listeners enjoyed 10 to Midnight, 12% were neutral, and no one appears to dislike the film, so that's good.
Apart from Justin.
Apart from Justin.
Justin, you should just close down this channel if you're just going to diss on these movies.
He would be in the neutral camp, Eric. Our listener of the week is Cthulhu P from YouTube, and he writes, "It's great, a bare-arse killer murdering nurses, whilst a gravel-faced Charlie Bronson pursues. And the standout moment when the killer has an Inga Erik moment when he's been framed is priceless." Yes, we forgot to mention that. It was totally an Inga moment. No! He goes on to say, "Would have loved your commentary on the recent Blu-ray release, and we were offered 10 to Midnight, but we had to turn it down for time constraints, unfortunately."
We were doing about 5 billion other commentaries at the same time.
That was from Cthulhu P, and you can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can listen on most podcatchers and YouTube. And consider supporting the show via Patreon for as little as $1 per month, or you can purchase some cool swag from our Redbubble shop. Just search The Hysteria Continues, and for feedback, our email address is thehysteriacontinues@gmail.com.
Excellent. I think did you send some feedback, Joseph? Or
No, I thought I had a feedback. It was just like a general question, so no feedback this week, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, well, get those coming in for next time. Talking of next time, whose turn is it next?
Joseph.
It's my turn.
Y'all's turn.
Yes, I picked a movie. I was going to try to out Nathan, and he's not even here to defend himself. So we're going to cover 1985's, well, it's something. It's The Deadly Intruder. It's which, if nothing else, has a wonderful scene with Danny Bonaducci in a television set.
I have never seen it.
It's got Molly Cheek in it from the Gary Shandling show.
Yeah,
that's what I remember.
Eric, it's a very Nathan-y movie, so prepare yourself.
Okay, I'm prepared.
Amanda, thank you for joining us. Is there anything you want to tell us about you've been up to recently?
Well, nothing I can think of. Oh, yeah. So I have some commentaries coming out over the next couple months. I've gotten so much work this year that I'm forgetting what's what. But so this month in February, I don't know when this is coming out, but towards the end of the month, I did a Region 2 Blu-ray release commentary for a movie called Pulse. It's coming out through Eureka. I just mentioned it earlier because of Paul Golding is the director of it. It stars Joey Lawrence. It's a really neat kind of haunted house, quote unquote, film that I really love, and I had a really good time doing the commentary for that. And next month, I did a commentary for Eureka again with my friend Lee Gambin for the horror movie Nightwing from 1979 with Nick Mancuso. That's a really pretty underrated little film, and I was really happy to be asked to do that. And I also have some liner notes coming out next month through Indicator for the release of Sam Raimi's Crime Wave, which is not a horror movie, but of course he has lots of horror movie ties. It was like this weird absurdist comedy that he did after Evil Dead that had a lot of production woes, but I think it's a pretty interesting film, and I really enjoyed writing about that aspect of it. And I think those are the things that I've done that have been announced. And I also have, I don't know when this is coming out, but our next episode of my podcast, which is called the Made for TV Mayhem Show, will have Joseph on, and I'm so thrilled because he's amazing and he knows his TV movies, so I'm excited. And it'll also mean that I've had all 4 of you on my show at some point, so that'll be coming out in the next few weeks too. And we're covering 2 Tammy Lawrence / Shawnee Smith TV movies. They made 2 TV movies together, and that is one called I Saw What You Did, which is a pretty classic late 80s TV movie, and something that I always forget the name of, but I think it's called Crime of Innocence, which starred them in... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to mention. I'd never heard of that movie until I looked into it. Then I realized I have seen it. It's got Andy Griffith is in it, and I saw that. I saw that when it actually came on TV back in 1985. So, or is 86 one of those years? But I actually remember that movie, so I'm looking forward to talking about it.
Yeah, I am too. I love those 2 actors together, Shawnee Smith and Tammy Lawrence. I love both of them individually too, but so I thought it'd be fun to put those 2 together. So we're going to be doing that.
I haven't seen I Saw What You Did in a long time, so I remember nothing about it, but I'm going to watch it this week.
Yay.
What are we playing out with? Eric, you've chosen a song.
Oh, yes. Well, I've chosen a song that I hope Amanda will like as well. This is from the wonderful Psychedelic Furs, and it's the title track from their 1987 album, Midnight to Midnight.
Ooh.
Oh, I like that song.
Yeah, it's a great song.
Okay, well, we're playing out with Eric's choice, and thank you for listening. So say goodbye to the good people.
Bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.